So really broadly, we as a foundation were founded at the end of 2012 when New Belgium Brewing Company, I love that we're in a brewery, when New Belgium Brewing Company became 100% employee owned. So the woman who started our foundation was the co-founder and CEO of New Belgium. She always, as part of her transition plan, knowing that she wasn't going to be running a brewery for her entire life, wanted to make sure that the positive, not only the culture and kind of ethos that she had built into her company, but the way that the company supported its employees would persist even after she was out of the professional picture. So her solution was, as I said, to sell it to her colleagues, and that was the liquidity event that allowed her to take that wealth and turn it into this foundation. So we're, at this point, 3.5 years old. We work in the communities that the board members are from. It's an almost exclusively family board. So for us, that's the Bay Area and California, the Colorado kind of Front Range, and then the Puget Sound, Seattle area. I actually do not live in Colorado. I was living in Oakland until this summer and recently moved to Ann Arbor, so kind of on a side note, it's exciting to learn more about everything that's going on in Detroit as I kind of get familiar with this new place for me. But so we fund in those 3 states, those 3 kind of metropolitan areas. There's certainly a conversation to be had about, I think, some of the points that have been raised already in terms of what places need more investment. How do you broaden who gets investment? What does it mean? We struggle with the fact that we fund 3 wealthy metropolitan areas that are in a lot of ways aligned with kind of the values that we believe in. On the one hand, in some ways we can help support a model that can be used in other places, but it's certainly a complicated thing to wrestle with. We fund in 4 program areas: renewable energy, sustainable food systems, alternative transportation, and youth engagement. And, I think maybe as a complement to that, obviously, grant making. And we also have our corpus 100% invested for impact with an impact investment advisor, and then have a carve out for early stage direct investment. So equity, PRIs, debt, market rate and below market rate. From our perspective, foundations have a lot of different types of capital at their disposal. And, the vision that I try to execute on is being flexible to being able to deploy whatever type of capital is needed in a particular situation. So, that involves a lot of conversations with people, involves understanding how they're building, what they're trying to build. And, fortunately, I have a board that's pretty amenable to risk and innovation and trying new things, and doesn't feel like we need to succeed at everything. I think there's certainly the conversation around privilege and philanthropy is an incredibly important one, and I think that appetite for risk encompasses some of that, and I think there's also a lot of way for us to go as an organization. So that's our program areas. And then I'll just kind of briefly, so we, as I said, we're 3.5 years old. Our plan was always to operate for, get a couple of years under our belt, learn by doing, obviously, thoughtfully, solicit feedback when possible. But after we had a couple years, look back on what we've done and use that to look forward and build kind of our next 5 years plan. So that's what I'm in the process of now. And, a lot of the themes that have already come up is kind of what I'm wrestling with and how I'm trying to build this institution to look forward. So that's issues of accountability. Who are we accountable to? How do we build that accountability that's productive, inclusive, progressive, pushes the field of philanthropy? Obviously, all foundations have their own kind of set of issues to negotiate. But I think the philanthropic space because of its reliance on wealthy donors, isn't always, nonprofits are accountable to foundations, and foundations are accountable to their boards, and that means that foundations are only as progressive or thoughtful as their boards are. And I think that's something that all foundations need to consider, and something that I'm working on. We work on a local level because that's where we know the community. I think it's really important for us to feel connected to these issues, and that's the way that we can have these conversations that allow greater risk, allow transparency and accountability to flow both ways. And maybe that's where I'll leave it, and we can kind of get into more specifics later. Thanks.
It's pretty awesome being funded by a brewery family foundation. Can't say that all the time. Even better, as Lucy said, that we are in a brewery today. So my name is Eric Kornacki. I'm the co-founder and executive director of a nonprofit based in Denver called Revision. And Revision was really an attempt to trying to kind of reflect on some of what I'm hearing today and use that as a way. But it's really an idea of how do we build a neighborhood economy, investing in the people and in that place, and find ways that we can activate the existing assets and resources of a given community to solve their own problems. And that's really kind of counterintuitive to the way I think philanthropy, the way community development happens. And so Revision is really trying to bring a new model for how we go about doing that into the world. So I live and work in a neighborhood in Southwest Denver called Westwood. Westwood is really the heart of the Latino community in Denver, 84% Hispanic, about 40% are Spanish first speakers. And Westwood is a historically redlined community. And so does everybody here know what that term means, redlined? No, okay. So redline would literally be when banks and elected officials would draw on a map with a red marker around a neighborhood and said, we're not investing in this community. And so it was a practice of historical and systemic racism to isolate communities of color from receiving investments. And so Westwood historically has been a working class neighborhood of immigrants. It's rolled over, who the immigrant community serving on the bottom has been. But in this day and age, it is the Hispanic community. And so a lot of the people in this community don't have the same investment, the same rights, the same avenues and pathways for opportunity that other communities have, and therefore has really seen some of the worst health and economic disparities. This picture, it's a real picture from a little bit about throughout my presentation, but I think it encapsulates so much of what our community has sort of become. A blighted community, barbed wired, empty shopping carts. This is a food desert neighborhood. It's a community that really suffered on the tail end of divestment for over 40 years. This was the last grocery store in our neighborhood. It shut down late 1990s, sat vacant for 15 years. It was recently by the city bulldozed after several pretty violent crimes had taken place there. Had been an eyesore and a problem spot from the neighborhood. The city and the community are now working to build a futsal court and turn that into a community asset. But this was the last serving grocery store in the neighborhood. We also live in the youngest neighborhood in all of Denver. Largest percentage of the population under the age of 18. We also have the lowest life expectancy. It's 12 years fewer than any other Denver neighborhood. And so for a family in this neighborhood, the average household size is about 5 people. Family purchases, annual expenditures of groceries, is $3,500 a year. So if you kind of round up and do the math, it comes out to less than $2 a person a day on groceries. Our children suffer from the highest rates of obesity and diet-related illness in the city. And so this is a pretty complex issue. There's no one sort of silver bullet or one approach that is going to solve it. But Revision came in, began listening to the community and saying, what do you want to do about this? Like, why? What are the barriers from preventing you from living the most healthy, productive life, and being involved in the solution. And no one had ever been invited to be part of the solution before. And so just by having conversations with the community, we found that there was such a wealth of assets that could be deployed. They just weren't being activated to solve this problem. And so we talked with mothers that were concerned about their kids' future and said, what do you need to do something about this? What do you want to do? And what we found is that most of the community has a connection to food and agriculture that is such a beautiful gift and a wealth of knowledge and resources that wasn't being utilized in this particular community. So where they came from, maybe they grew a lot of the food that they had, they shared with each other, nobody was hungry, they ate healthy, and then they moved here, and they're living in this concrete jungle where they don't know where they can grow food, they don't know their neighbors, they live in isolation, they don't have access to the traditional foods that they have depended upon, and so they're suffering because of it. So we said, what would it take for you to take that knowledge and put it into place in your neighborhood? And they were really, really simple barriers, such as like, well, I don't speak English, I don't know how to talk to my landlord, or I'm from Mexico and there's no way you can grow food in Colorado. So we began hiring them. We said, we're going to give you a good paying job. We're going to help you connect to your neighbors, and you're going to teach them. So we now have over 10 community members that are almost full-time. We call them our promotoras, so it's a model of health promotion. They teach their neighbors how to grow food, everything from how to plan your garden to what to plant, what to harvest, how to cook with it, how to preserve the harvest into the season. Some families, such as David here, his family produces 70% of what they eat off of their front yard garden. It's over 2,000 square feet. They share the surplus. It's an amazing thing. So I'm going to flip through a couple of time progressions just so you can see where it started. So 2009, when we began having those conversations, it started with 7 families. And then just because the promoters live and work in the community and know the networks, this was them being at the face of the solution. And so this became a word of mouth effort. And by 2014, we had 400 families participating in this. This is all word of mouth. This is all grassroots. It's all organically grown, quite literally. And as I mentioned, as the neighborhood, as this was growing, people realized that there's a surplus, and like we're asking questions of, can we sell food? How do I go about doing that? And so through community organizing and listening campaigns, we found that there was a lot of people that wanted to sell extra food. There's also the broader context of we still need a grocery store in the community. And wanting to come up with a solution ourselves as opposed to trying to bring in an outside store, we said, let's start it. So the community came together. They formed a for-profit cooperative called the Westwood Food Cooperative. Revision is an incubator of that. We approached our city Office of Economic Development, convinced them of the wide-scale buy-in to this program. City said, yes, we'll help you find a property to develop this store. So we purchased a 1.7 acre junkyard that was a blighted property in the neighborhood, began using community volunteer efforts to tear it down. We hauled off over 500,000 tons of trash and debris, stripping old buildings down, recycling them. And currently, we are building what we call Rise Westwood, which is a hub for a community-owned, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable economy to celebrate the cultural diversity of the neighborhood and create a place where people can come, gather, access healthy food, workforce training. This is a current sort of schematic for the site plan. It includes 35 affordable housing units, a 16,000 square foot for-profit greenhouse that will be run by community members, a 14,000 square foot grocery store, that's going to be the future Westwood Food Cooperative, as well as a community-run fitness center and a youth workforce training program. So just going to kind of leave on this quote from our mayor because I think it really touches this point of what we're trying to build. We're trying to change the system by creating community ownership. And he says it so well by saying that this is a business that exists to serve the specific needs of a community and therefore can never be uprooted and outsourced somewhere else. And I think in today's day and age where we see there's so much talk about outsourcing and trade and this and that, this idea of place-based and locally owned businesses is so important, particularly when people that have been left out of the conversation, that don't have access to capital, that have never been risen to a managerial level, can come together and create that for themselves. This is a truly transformative approach. So with that, I'm out of time, and thank you.
Thank amazing work. I keep thinking about like Bill Clinton having this quote throughout the last year or two on the campaign about, maybe in like the New Yorker or something, about how Americans were dying of hopelessness, of broken heart, of a broken heart. And he was particularly speaking about, white rural working class. But when he said that, I thought, well, that's everybody. Everybody needs to be empowered and believed in, and that's kind of I've been thinking about that through all the presentations. We all need agency and voice and power. Anyway, super inspiring work. Can you guys start by talking about how you connected initially, how you hooked up, and then dated, flirted, how that relationship came to be, and also what the relationship is, and then we'll open up to more questions.
Maybe I'll start. So, as Lucy mentioned, the New Belgium Family Foundation came out of the sale of Kim Jordan, the CEO, her share of the company back into the employee stock ownership program. And when I was a college student, growing up in Colorado, like New Belgium, pre-college, like high school, Fat Tire, New Belgium, were set my palate for my beer choices later on in life. But more than just like great beer, New Belgium is a truly amazing progressive company. And so when I was in college, I was actually studying the way that they had structured the company, and the fact that it was one of the few successful stories of an employee-owned or worker-owned business model that was still operating within the capitalist system, but choosing to make sure that values were infused in everything. And so when they, we were looking at their programs, and when they decided to go the foundation route and support sustainable agriculture, it was like, oh yeah, duh. And so I think we were probably one of the first applicants in the door.
Yeah, it was. I was thinking about this in preparation for this talk, and I had never been the executive director of a foundation before, and so my kind of working model was basically to show up, schedule a meeting, reach out to nonprofits and schedule a meeting, but then pretty much walk in the door and be like, we've talked about it and we're going to give you a grant. And obviously people like that. But it also, it took some practice to kind of know how to build relationships and understand what information was going to be useful for us, to kind of build a relationship over time. And so I think, I went and met with Eric and his co-founder, as it was certainly in our second round of grantees, so very early in the organization, and kind of had that preliminary conversation, but I think it wasn't kind of until we had a couple years and kind of over the course of those couple years since then that the relationship has unfolded. And I think, that's been through open communication. I think, there have been a couple points, whether it's, specific to the projects that they're working on, the property that Eric talked about is an immense undertaking. And so when we started, he was like, we're starting to think about this, you want to go take a look at this gigantic block of trash that we just bought? It's obviously there's a dialogue of what are you thinking and who's involved and how did you decide on this idea? And that's a really important piece of what foundations, again, can do and how I think it's important for us to show up in the communities that we work.
Can I ask one question here? When he showed you the pile of trash, so that takes imagination from both of you, had he done something already to win your trust that he could see that project through?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know that it was any specific thing. I think it was, that at that point was probably 2 years into us knowing each other. So it was just that, kind of regular communication. And, so there were points when I had questions about how they were thinking about things and reached out and asked those questions. And that was a really important, that kind of open communication from both sides, I think, was a really important part of how we were then able to kind of continue that relationship. And it helps my board understand too, why we do the things that we do. Because then I can say, yeah, I've taught, this is what they're thinking.
When you connected for the first transaction, whatever that was, did you make a commitment to get married for a period of time, or have you just evaluated opportunities on a case-by-case basis?
I don't know. I hope it's a long-term relationship. But one thing Lucy just said that I think is so innovative in the way that they approach it, and I'm assuming it comes partially from your DNA of coming out of this forward progressive thinking brewery, but she asks the most thoughtful and thought-provoking questions about my work that I have ever received. And so I remember the first year we applied, it was, I think, $10,000. It wasn't a large amount. They were very small. I wasn't expecting the engagement to be so, just deep into the work, as opposed to doing the traditional, due diligence and audits and, all of that stuff, right? And then just give us the grant and ask for the report. So from the get-go, it was okay, this, Lucy in particular asks the deep questions, and then we'll think about it and come back and ask the follow-up deep questions. And I know it's not because it's trying to make the process burdensome for me or make me jump through, unnecessary hoops. It's really about helping, and I learned through the engagement of, let me really think about why is it that we're doing this, or how does it fit in with the way you're looking at it. So it's pretty unique in that sense.
Well, because you're not just getting an investor, you're getting a coach and mentor and partner and all of those things, right? Is that how you would characterize your relationship?
And I don't know if that's
your
the same for
partner's in
every.
it as well as.
Well, I'll say to give some context, and someone said this earlier. I present to my board grantees that align with our core values, and we give general operating grants. And one of the first things that we did as a foundation was to talk about those core values and define those core values, and that's something that I think in a lot of ways frees us up to act bravely or differently than a lot of philanthropy. We come at this, and I try and come at this from a place of kind of authenticity, and that authenticity has been discussed and I guess you can't discuss authenticity, but the values have been discussed. And, we make general operating grants because I believe that the nonprofits that I work with know so much more than I do about what they should be doing. I don't feel like it's my place to dictate how or why somebody does a certain thing. And so, that certainly means that maybe, and this is, again, where relationships come into play, then it's my responsibility to make sure that I have done that kind of character due diligence with the leaders, with the organization. But once that hurdle has been achieved, I can kind of step back and be like, and those are the questions Eric's talking about. Why do you do this way? Why do you think about it this way?
Well, and how much does the person at the helm matter? Because I'm thinking back to you, and I'm thinking about these different projects. You're putting trust as much as probably in him as the project itself. So if Phil were to move to California, you were to move to Cincinnati, how do you see the relationship between the talent and the work?
I think that's a really important aspect, and it's also something I struggle with in terms of who has. This is definitely a work in progress for me personally and for us as an organization. I think that's really important. I think that allows the freedom I was just talking about. It allows the kind of flexibility and adaptability to our process. But I'm also really aware that I was raised in certain communities, was educated a certain way, was exposed to certain opportunities that not everybody else was. And so that makes me biased towards people who have the same privilege that I do. And as I said, it's totally a work in progress and something that I think a lot about, how I think it's important to have the flexibility to invest in people, but I also think it's really important that we try and structure, again, I mean, somebody said kind of structuring accountability to diversity. And I definitely, I mean, I'd love ideas of how to do that, how, it's a hard issue, or it comes with problems also.
Yeah, and from my perspective, it's interesting because the way we're trying to approach our work is I do not want to be at leadership in 3 years' time. We set a 10-year timeline from when we began working in Westwood to say, the end of 10 years, this needs to be a fully community-run organization. And so the question of does it matter who's at the helm? I personally say, no, it doesn't. In fact, it can't be me. It needs to be one of our promotores. And so we've begun building the scaffolding and the pathways so that every position in the organization will be fully staffed and run by a community member. And to do so, our promotores, none of them most of these women did not have more than a 6th grade education when we first started working with them. They all are now either on their pathway to completing their GED or have their GED. Some of them are enrolling in college. And we've had to do so many things that are outside our, quote unquote, mission, and convincing our sort of more institutional funders that, hey, I don't want to be at the helm. You don't. That's a great measure of success, is if I am not here. But in order to do so, you've got to believe in that vision too, that it's about bringing our promotores up to executive leadership level, and that spooks kind of the institutional players.
Well, everyone should be trying to put themselves out of a job, I feel like, on both sides of this equation. So that's an interesting challenge for a funder. I can see that. Any other questions?
I just kind of wanted to know about your process, Eric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In terms of how you started the organization, because I think a lot of people don't realize you have to have resources to start an organization.
Yeah.
Did you see a problem and then create it, or were people telling you there's a problem? Was it an idea and then oh, here's something, or I just want to start a nonprofit? How did that start for you?
Sure. It started out pretty vague. I mean, I had just graduated college and didn't want to go into the traditional job market, and really was trying to change, quote unquote, the system of how do we rethink the economy, how do we rethink, and how do we tear down structural racism and structural inequity. And so Revision started out as pretty vague idea, and he was passionate about food, and I really believe that food is a strong vehicle to building the type of world that we want. This is a great quote. This is by one of our promotores. And our theory of change is really this, that we begin a direct relationship with a family, and then that family, when they're given the right pathway, can change their community, and then so on, right? And I was working in a coffee shop, had a couple artist friends design really cool t-shirts for me, started selling those, slinging them from behind the counter, raised $8,000. That was basically our seed fund. In terms of how we landed in this specific community, I was talking at a community forum on food justice, and somebody said, you really need to come into my neighborhood. We're facing a severe health crisis, and nobody's doing anything about it. From there, it was just talking to mainly to the women of the neighborhood, the mothers, and understanding the issue, but then also seeing their potential and how it was not being realized, and trying to connect those dots.
So I have a little bit of a provocative question for you. So here's the first part of it. How much money, I saw the sort of block project, how much money do you need to borrow to make that a reality? So that's part one.
Okay.
And then here's a provocative part two is you talk about, the work that you're doing to develop the community leaders to be able to take over the organization. My question is, what needs to happen in the community to be able to, let's say it's $1 million or $10 million, to be able to give a $10 million loan to Latino low-income women?
Great question. So the total scope of that development with housing and everything is $25 million. We received a $1.3 million grant from the city to purchase it. The main driving force behind that is the Westwood Food Cooperative, which I kind of mentioned briefly, but that's a community-owned for-profit business that is a member-owned business, you've got to pay your equity. So we right now have about 264 members that have all paid $200 each for their equity share. So there's that vehicle, and that is going to basically pay for its build out. Can't raise the money for that full project. It would take, quite a while within our community. But what we are trying to show people, and this was the conversation we had that led us to forming the grocery store, there's a lot of economic power in the neighborhood. They just don't realize it. And so when we did a feasibility study for just groceries and found that within a 3-minute driving distance of where we're located, the community spends almost $19 million a year on groceries. But because there's not a store, because they're leaving to go shop somewhere else, wherever that may be, that money leaves. And that's a lot of purchasing power when you look at it. It may not be, as we said, it's not a lot per household, but it's a lot as a community. And so when we said, what if we took that $19 million and that was all going annually into a community-owned and operated grocery store, people were like, oh my God, yeah, we've got collective power. It's just a matter of putting the mechanisms in place.
How are we at time?
Like, fine.
All right.
That collective power, it requires individual members of the community to understand and commit to using that power. How did you achieve that understanding and that commitment to collective action?
Hiring people, beginning by saying that this can't be led by me. I live in the community, but I'm not representative of the broader community. And so we began hiring women, and then it was their job to work with neighbors. And because food is sort of the doorway, each promotora has about 30 to 40 families that they work with throughout an entire year, teaching them how to garden, eat healthy, and so on. And so it's just a relationship. When you've got that trust that is being established, then we're able to plant the seeds to help people realize that they already have that power. It's just a matter of believing in it and then activating it. And it could not happen in our case if we did not have promotoras that live and work in the community that are able to build it.
So they were essentially your labor organizers.
They were organizers, and they've gone through organizing training. Yeah, I mean it's.
Just out of curiosity, had you not had a high density for people who had agricultural
Mm-hmm.
and a cultural environment of using that for their own food production, how would that have changed your approach to dealing with the particular problems that you were trying to address in the community? Would it have been possible for this solution to change with more, chicken and egg?
Yeah. So the easy answer is I don't think it would have happened. I mean, the solution came out of recognizing that as an asset in the community. We probably would have done something very differently. I'm very upfront that what we've done is a very place-centric approach, and it cannot just be replicated in another community without understanding those cause and conditions and for me the biggest is cultural homogeneity. 84% of the community share an identity, and most of them share a similar experience in their sort of first-generation immigrant family in the United States. So we're able to really leverage that. In a diverse melting pot, where maybe there's not that strong identity, it's much harder to build community, as we know, and that's why cities struggle to be neighborly with one another, and why Pony Ride and so many of these projects are really about, at the core, building community, and then coming up with solutions to tackle problems. But if you don't have community, you don't have anything to stand on.
One more? One more and then we're done.
Are you scouting your next project?
We're not. So in terms of strategic planning, that was sort of 3 years ago where we thought we'd be at this time, is scouting our next project. I've since sort of worked with the community and organization and our funders and board to say we're actually doubling down. We're going much deeper in this community. Displacement and gentrification is a huge, huge issue in Denver right now for many reasons, which I'd love to talk to. If you know what Colorado people, first thing to ask me when I travel is tell me about pot, tell me about marijuana, right? That has put a huge strain on our housing in Denver. And long story short, because our model is so place-based, and we live in a historically disenfranchised neighborhood, it's where the development is beginning to move into. And so we're having to look at other systems and approaches outside of food and such. We're in the process of getting a community-owned land trust formed. Affordable housing kind of emerged to the surface of like, we need to do other things to improve and strengthen the resiliency of the neighborhood so that people aren't involuntarily displaced. Otherwise, we don't have anything, and all of this, kind of in the long run fails.
May I ask a quick question? Quick. Did you find any support or coaching from any of the national intermediaries like Enterprise, LISC, NeighborWorks?
No,
Anywhere in your work?
no. I just actually reached out to Enterprise and LISC the other day to try to pull them in at this point. But early on, no. I mean, it was really guided just by community. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for sharing your story. Appreciate it. Can we keep moving without a break? Yeah. Let's not break because then we'll have lunch after the reward. It's hard to get everyone back together. Thank you guys so much. The last final pair is Cincinnati, local, woohoo. So Megan Trishler from Hale, a U.S. Bank Foundation, and Jason Snell from Cosign, among other projects. Start with you. Yeah.